This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. This is the point where I typically ask you to rate and review the podcast, and of course, I'd like you to do that. But the truth is that the podcast grows by word of mouth. Can you tell someone about the podcast and even go the next step? Maybe for someone who hasn't listened to podcasts before, help them set up a podcatcher and set up the Graceful Atheist Podcast on their podcatcher. As usual, this Tuesday, we will have the Deconversion Anonymous hangout with this week's guest, led by our community manager, Arlene. Please join us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion, and that is Tuesday night at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. My guest today is Andrew Pledger. Andrew grew up in the IFB church. As an adult now, he recognizes a lot of religious trauma as he was growing up. The Christian school wasn't good enough, so he was homeschooled. When it was time to go to college, he persuaded his parents to not force him to go to Pensacola University and instead to go to Bob Jones. Bob Jones was the better choice in Andrew's mind. Andrew was repressing himself and his sexuality, and all of this came out in painful depression. This is your content warning for some discussion of mental health issues and depression. In Andrew's senior year at Bob Jones University, he did an interview with Josh Harris about his experience, and this got him kicked out of Bob Jones University. Today, Andrew is an activist trying to spread the word about religious trauma and the pain that it can cause. Here is Andrew Pledger to tell his story. Andrew Pledger, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Andrew, I really appreciate you reached out to me. I understand that you are an activist in the realm of religious trauma and deconstruction, and your experience in evangelicalism. It doesn't sound like it was a whole lot of fun. So.
Not really, no. It was a hell show, definitely.
Okay. We'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
And you had done an interview with Josh Harris that kind of made you a little famous. So what I want to begin with is your story, and then we will get to your activism and the work that you're doing these days. So let's start at the beginning. What was your Christian faith like?
Yes. So I was born into fundamentalist Christianity. More specifically, I grew up in the IFB church, which means like Independent Fundamental Baptist. These kinds of churches usually take a KJV only stance. And for people who don't know what that means, it means the King James Version of the Bible. Like that's the only legitimate Bible to them.
Right.
And any other Bible is like heresy or false or whatever. So that's one of the very extreme views that they take. And also in fundamentalism, women are basically subjugated and looked down upon a lot. And in the church I grew up in, it was greatly discouraged that women wear pants. Like they had to wear skirts or dresses like way below the knee, like touching the ground, basically.
Yeah.
Women could not speak in the pulpit. And there were, of course, women can sing in the church. Thankfully, they're allowed to do that. But I do remember in my church that some women would like do a little inspirational talk before they're singing. And sometimes, or a lot of the times, the pastor would get really upset with that.
Wow. Yeah.
And would make comments about it in front of everyone, the whole church. And, I was like, growing up, I was a child. Like,
Sure.
I thought everything they believed was correct, 100% right, that God or whatever didn't want women to have any kind of power or say whatsoever. And of course, as I got older, I deconstructed a lot of that. And I think really in fundamentalism, these parents really do like try to isolate their children. And
Mm.
homeschooling is very, very big in fundamentalist Christianity. And there are different kinds. Like, for example, I've heard of people, they were homeschooled under Bill Gothard's teachings, which are is the Basic Life Principles Institute. Thankfully, I never grew up under that.
Okay.
My parents really like control the curriculum. They loved Abeka, which I don't
Yes.
know if you've heard of them. Okay, you have.
I have, and we do, just so you know, Andrew, we have lots of listeners that
Mm-hmm.
deconstructed out of IFB.
Uh-huh.
And again, similar horror stories
Yes.
of homeschooling and things like that. But yes, but please do describe it for us. So
Oh, yeah. So Abeka curriculum is produced at like Pensacola Christian College in Florida, which is the college my parents really wanted me to go to. But thankfully, I was able to get out of that. But they chose Abeka because Pensacola Christian College and the Abeka curriculum, they have that fundamentalist view, basically of like King James version only, and subjugating of women, and like very homophobic ideology. And definitely in their curriculum, it paints a very like pretty picture of all white people, basically.
yes, yeah,
Like, you know what I
very,
mean?
very
Like
whitewashed. Yes.
very whitewashed, very like nationalist, I guess you would say,
Okay.
type agendas in their curriculum. And you know, I wouldn't say that it was like a terrible education. Some of Becca's subjects were very difficult, not gonna lie. But I think the hard thing about it was because there were certain subjects that like I was not educated on, like sex education, for example. I had no sex education growing up.
Right.
I don't know anything about evolution really, so that's something I'm starting to finally dig into. And so really these systems are all about control and also growing their congregations.
Mm.
And, you know, it's really, really creepy because growing up, I remember like in my teen years, like the pastor encouraging the teens to get together with the girls of the church and get married, have kids, and just populate the church.
Yes.
And like, I was like, okay. And I remember that happened one night, and like all the teens, like we had a teen section, and like after the pastor said that, all the girls like left the section. Like they were so uncomfortable
Yeah. Oh man.
with that, which I totally understand because he acted like they were just like a baby making machine, and like that's all they were good for. They just needed to stay at home and like cook and clean and not have a career or do any of those things.
Right.
And you know, again, like I said earlier, that was just so normal to me because that's all I knew. Because I was homeschooled, I grew up in the IFB church, and you know, there were other social activities I was involved in, but it was like I was in a homeschool group, which is very conservative Christian, still in a 4-H group, which is still the same people in that. So even if I did socialize, it was still that religion somehow involved in it.
I talk about this as the bubble where
Yes.
every media and the books that you're reading and the conversations that you're having are
Mhm.
all within the same bubble, and it
Mhm.
all reinforces itself, and nothing that
Yes.
is contrary or contradictory is ever allowed in. That's shut down.
No.
That's wrong. It's sinful. It can't be listened to.
No. And so like there's really what's damaging about it is that it really discourages critical thinking skills.
Right.
Most definitely. Because like if you're not subjected to different worldviews or different ideas, how can you even think critically about your own? You can't. And that's the point. Because they
Yes.
want you to blindly submit and accept it because they need your money, they need your attendance, and all these things. And, you know, a lot of these churches, they would not be running without people giving them money at all. Because, like, they're tax exempt, a lot of them are. And they love to really like talk about in sermons how, oh, God's blessing us, God's doing this, but God's doing that. But it's just these people are giving you money.
Mm.
Like, and without these people giving you money, you wouldn't be here. And there's really a lot of manipulation to when it comes to giving money in the church. And I remember growing up, eventually there was an exodus that happened in my IFB church,
Okay.
and a lot of people left. And of course, that's very concerning for the church leadership, because number one, it makes the church look bad because clearly something went wrong that made people leave, and that's also going to hurt their pay and just running the church in general, because it costs a lot to run big facilities with all the things that are involved. And the church I went to, it was a huge campus. It used to have like probably like 5,000 to 8,000 a Sunday in the 90s, because we had a bus ministry too. But the church I grew up in, it's called Gospel Light Baptist Church. It's in Walkertown, North Carolina. It was used to be pastored by Brother Bobby Robertson until he passed away in 2018, I think. But he was definitely well known in like IFB circles, and he knew John R. Rice and Jack Hyles, and a couple of those like big figures in the fundamentalist movement. And like my church, we would have also the Sword of the Lord conferences.
Yes.
Every year. We would host one of those, and a lot of people would come, and they'd be preaching. And I remember hating that so much as a kid. But anyways, oh God, going to that extra church, yay, every day for a week. I don't get this enough anyways.
Can I ask just real quick, what caused the exodus from your church?
That is so interesting, because I have wondered that. And I'm not 100% really sure, because as a child, I was told basically that those people weren't faithful, that they were going to like bad or like more secular or contemporary churches, and that they were following the devil's way or whatever. So
you were still very young when this happened.
I was so young. Yes. I was probably around 10 years old when it happened.
Got it.
And, looking back, I can definitely like have guesses to why people left.
Yes.
And definitely the very controlling environment, very shame-based and fear-based preaching. It was a major like fire and brimstone kind of church. And like, in the IFB movement, they talk all about salvation, which is like asking Jesus to your heart, and then you're saved, you can go to heaven, blah, 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 all that. And I remember, as a child, like saying that sinner's prayer or whatever to get to heaven. And I did it after a sermon where the preacher just described all of these graphic, horrific things about hell. And of course, as a child, that scared me. And like, you're going to believe what adults tell you. They tell you that there's demons wanting to torture you forever, and like a fire chamber, like, or area. It's like, of course it's going to scare children, and they're going to do anything to feel safe, really.
Yes.
And so I feel like at a young age, even though I might not have realized it then, but like, I didn't really have a choice when it came to religion, really, because if I did reject it, then I would have been treated like the black sheep my whole life, and just would have been punished a lot or looked down on. And a lot of children who are born into these environments learn that in order to be loved and accepted, they just have to conform.
That phrasing, I think, is really significant, that you did not have a choice. That is really profound, actually.
Yeah, and I think it happens sadly to a lot of children. And I think what happens is they really want to get you at a young age. Because if they decided to indoctrinate people at like, oh, let's just start at 20 years old, like that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Because people have already, like, their brains have developed so much more, their critical thinking skills. So they get them at a young age where they will really, because their children are dependent on their parents and on adults for physical needs, for emotional needs. And children adapt naturally to what they need to do, whether they realize they're doing it or not, to thrive and or try to thrive and survive in their environment. And a lot of children, um, they grow up in this, they realize all the harm that's done to their psyche, and then a lot of us figure out, oh my gosh, I'm struggling with religious trauma. This has really, really messed me up. And it's interesting because there are some people who grew up in it and they accept it and they stay in it their whole lives.
Yeah.
Which is just mind blowing to me. And it's just interesting how people can grow up in the same situation or similar circumstances and have different outcomes, I guess you would say. And I think it comes down to a big part of it is personality type. I think certain personality types are really drawn to that kind of environment because even when we're adults, we still have that childlike need and want for depending on someone like bigger or than us, if that makes sense. Like it's scary to be independent, to be free.
It's a comforting belief, and I found as I'm significantly older than Andrew, if that isn't obvious, but I found as I've gotten older and I've lost family members, that death in particular, I think is a major driving factor for why people remain within religion. That needs to, I'm going to see my family member again someday.
Oh yes, and like there are definitely a lot of like psychological reasons why people are attracted to it, and a lot of people don't actually, I think, consciously realize it. And really, in this time of my life, I've really been like digging deeper into the psychology of religion, of cults, and different things, just understanding how people, like, number one, like why they're attracted to these things, what part of them is attractive, and how they actually stay in it so long, and why do some stay and why do some leave? What's the variables? What's the difference? What's going on? And last week I read a book called The Psychology of Religious Fundamentalism, and it was very, very interesting, and it really went into depth. And it talked about a lot of core needs that these fundamentalist religions provide for people.
Right.
So, number one, people have such a strong desire and need for meaning and purpose. And religions provide that meaning and purpose. They provide a worldview where a God supposedly loves and cares about you. And, number two, everyone wants to feel like, I guess you would say, they're special and unique. And like, I inherently believe, obviously, all people are special and unique, but not everyone feels that. Not everyone feels that way about themselves. You need some external validation to push that. And that religion provides it because God knew you before he formed the worlds. Like you're a part of his plan. You're special.
Right.
Like you're here for a reason. So it gives you that purpose. It gives you that sense of feeling special. And it gives you a sense of security too, most definitely, of like there's someone, if I follow this rule, and do this and this, then this higher power is always going to look out for me, and justice will happen if I can't do it myself in the end. And, I'm trying to think of like the other ones that he had said in this book. So there was purpose, feeling special, security. Oh yeah, obviously like community. Like we're social beings. We really need community.
Yeah.
And if you feel like you fit into that kind of environment, then you will thrive, I guess.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Right.
At all. No, that was hell. But it provides all of these psychological needs. And, reading about it, and I was like, wow, I'm like, I can definitely understand why people are so attached to it. And I think for me, the reason I wasn't so attached to it, because those needs that provided for them, it did not provide those needs for me. And maybe it was when I was more younger, but as I got older, I struggled so much with my mental health, and like I wasn't sure why. I really struggled a lot with depression and anxiety and some OCD, and there's so much shame in these
Mm,
fundamentalist environments around mental health. It's really in these environments is considered a sin. Like you're not trusting God enough. You don't have the right relationship with God. You just need to trust God and get closer to Him more and more. Like it's basically your fault. And there's
yeah.
so much victim blaming when it comes to mental health. And so because there's so much shame around it, people don't want to talk about it because they don't want to be judged or looked down upon or seen as like a weaker Christian or something. And it was really hard growing up in that because I really did have to like try to hide my mental health when I finally learned that people weren't going to they were not taking it seriously. They were not helpful
Mm,
about it.
yeah.
And, I think there was an instance when I was like 16, like I went through a depressive episode and then I tried to hide it. And I eventually got so depressed, I stopped eating and
Oh,
I
wow.
like lost like 20 pounds in like 2 weeks. And like I was very like physically and mentally sick, because of that mind and body connection. And, I wasn't taken to any kind of healthcare at all.
Right.
My dad didn't understand it. He just got really angry about me about struggling to eat. My mom would just cry and just not say anything. He just didn't know how to deal with it. And I felt so helpless and really hopeless in that situation because I was not educated on mental health and not really on a lot of things. Um, the thing that people they were telling me that would fix my issues was not fixing the issues. The whole reading the Bible and praying thing was not working. And that was the point where I'm like, there has to be another reason why.
Hmm.
And, thankfully, I eventually somehow got out of that. But even as I got older, I still had like episodes of depression. And like, I think my last one was in like 2020. And I think it was like that was my fourth depressive episode at like 20 years old
Okay.
that I had. And I think that was the point where I was like, you know what? I'm really like, there is something deeper, much deeper going on here. And part of it I knew what the reasons, some reasons were, not all of it, but it was just, I knew that I really just needed to get out of that environment.
Yeah.
It was just so unhealthy and I felt so stuck in it. When I really started, I guess, questioning the church was probably like in my teen years, probably
Okay.
when I started struggling with my sexuality because I was taught a very like narrow, specific thing about the LGBTQ plus community. And like, of course, fundamentalists, they have very like hateful and angry sermons about that. And so I think for me, I guess you would say I had a moment of like cognitive dissonance where, I believed a very awful thing about LGBTQ plus people, but then I was experiencing those things myself. So that it caused that cognitive dissonance where this isn't what they told me about this. Like they told me that this was a choice, that people do this and that they're evil, awful, terrible, awful people. But it's like once I started figuring out that those premises weren't true, it then got me thinking like, okay, what else are
What
they
else
wrong
does it?
about?
Yeah,
What else? What
exactly.
else?
That is a very dangerous question to ask yourself, Andrew.
Yes. It's like if they're wrong about this, it's like the house of cards. When you pull one card, the whole house comes tumbling down.
Exactly. Yeah. I've said this a number of times, but my heart absolutely breaks for you, Andrew, and anyone who,
Yeah.
regardless of their sexual orientation, but just under purity culture in general,
Yeah.
experiencing normal human growing up and desires, and then having that internalized as bad or evil or wrong in some way that just utterly
Yeah.
crushes me.
Yeah, I mean, it's really terrible, and like purity culture has harmed a lot of people, and really, I would say everyone, a lot, well, not everyone, but a lot of people involved. And like, there are different approaches to purity culture, But
Sure.
the one that I grew up in was like the very fundy, fear-based one. And like I'm sure there are churches, probably most likely they're probably more liberal. They
Yeah.
take a more I've seen, thankfully, as I've been on the internet, I've seen some churches where I've been shocked of some of the sex education they provide to people
Uh-huh.
that seems safe and wholesome. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this would be so great if all churches did this. But it's a very, very small minority of churches
Exactly. Yeah.
who
Yeah. Yeah.
actually have a healthy view of sex. But in the main purity culture movement and fundamentalism, there's so much shame and fear around it. And basically, from a very young age, you just, I can't remember when they first really tried to introduce it to children, which is really creepy, honestly. Because I think, from especially like for women at a young age, they're taught to like cover up, like they're an object to be wanted, desired, and that if they don't cover up and like a man like rapes them or sexually assaults them, it's their fault because they didn't cover up or something. Like it's not on the man, it's always on the woman and just what she's wearing.
And in the case of a teenager, it's really just a young woman, a child, really
Yes, a child, yeah.
becoming a young woman, and like to put that kind of burden on them is abuse.
Oh, it really is. And I think too, they love to talk in these churches about how sex is just it's a wonderful, beautiful thing at marriage.
Right. Right.
At
Right.
marriage. And then they're like, like don't have any kind of lustful thoughts. Don't touch yourself in any kind of sexual way. Don't be sexual with anyone else, blah, blah, blah. And like they had this very negative like view of sex, like it's some atomic bomb or something that if you mess with, it's just going to explode and destroy everything in your life. So there's all this fear around it and negativity. And then it's like, okay, so you have all these negative experiences with sexuality. And then when you're married, that switch is just supposed to go off when you've been conditioned all those years to have this negative view of sex. And that's what a lot of people experience when they wait till marriage, is that they finally get a chance to have sex. And then they feel disgusted with themselves for even wanting to do it, even though their religion told them, okay, these are the right circumstances, you can do it. And really, that's the power of mind control, really, is that all those messages that's ingrained in you for so long, you associate feelings with those circumstances, and it's called a conditioned reflex in psychology. So for me, my experience of that is that I had so many years of hearing very hateful homophobic sermons. I had so much internalized homophobia because of that conditioned response to that. So it took so long for me just to deconstruct those hateful beliefs and those stereotypes and just the generalizing of that group of people.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think in those fundamentalist environments, innocence is taken away at such a young age because, number one, the fear they put into you with like demons, fire, and hell, and they talk about like the afterlife, just talking about these ultimate big questions of life, and really what religion and religions worldwide, they always, and really what us as humanity have always been trying to look for is like those three like main like ultimate questions, like where do we come from, and how do we, what's our purpose here and right now, and where are we going to go after we die, like what's going to happen. Those are three like unknowns, really. And so many people have like in religions have tried to answer that like 100%, like, oh, this is the 100% correct way. And it's like, science is still trying to help us figure out all of those answers too. And I think it's something that will take a very long time. And some of them we might not be able to even answer at all. And I feel like, this is really hard for people in these environments, is to just be okay with the unknown, to accept that.
Yes.
But
yeah.
Just be like, you know what? I don't know what's going to happen when I die, but that's okay because I don't think it's going to be this terrible. It's going to be okay. But for these people, no, no, like they find comfort in certainty, this extreme certainty of being right about absolutely everything. And I understand, like, there is comfort in certainty, most definitely. And I would say that, certainty is a human need, stability, but also uncertainty is also a human need too, which is
Mm.
funny because we need certainty and we need uncertainty. Because the issue with just having certainty in your life and no uncertainty, like as human beings, we need something spontaneous in our lives. Just having this very strict, organized structure to our lives, so we know everything's that we're going to do day in and day out, like that's so mind numbing to me.
Yeah.
That's so awful to me. And like
Yeah.
for me, I'm a very organized person. So I have my own schedule. And there are times when I'm like, I've done the same thing every day for a week. Like I need to change this up. This is driving me insane. So yes, there are pros and cons to both sides, but what it comes down to really is we need that balance of both things, most definitely. But
Yeah.
these fundamentalists have some just leaning or a much stronger need, it seems like, for that certainty. Looking back at my parents and like their behaviors and trying to understand, why they behaved the way they did, why they believed the way they did. And, for background on my parents, they graduated from Hiles Anderson College, which is a fundamentalist college in Chicago. It was very big in the 80s. Jack Hiles, he's the one who founded that college. And it was like an extension of his church there, First Baptist, I think, or something like that in that town. But yeah, so my dad, he studied to be a pastor. My mom studied to be a Christian school teacher. They were both fundamentalist Christians. They met there, fell in love, got married, I think in like 1990 after they graduated.
Okay.
And, they decided that they wanted to have a family and, raise them in the church. And like homeschooling wasn't something they considered at first, but after, I think it was like 6 to 7 years or something, they were childless and they thought they would never have children. And they considered adoption. And then so like I'm the middle child, like I'm a son of three other boys. And so when my brother came along in the late 90s, there
Mhm.
was finally like, they're like, oh my gosh, we finally have a child now. Oh my gosh. And like they were just so excited. And my mom had enough experience with like Christian school teaching where she's like, you know what? I don't want our kids going in public school and I don't want them to be in a Christian school either, because she taught in a Christian school and she saw the things that went on even in that kind of environment. And so they were definitely unsure about it. So they decided to homeschool us basically our whole lives, and basically,
So even Christian school was too much. not
yes,
not good, not good enough. So okay,
no,
gotcha.
no, not good enough.
Yeah.
I know that was funny, and like I think it was rough being so isolated like that and in that environment. But I honestly think Christian school would have been worse for me personally.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Honestly, like that would have been really bad. And
I can see
I
that.
thought,
Yeah.
yeah. I can just see myself being shoved in the lockers like every single day. Like, but I think the thing I am grateful for homeschooling was that the opportunity that it gave me, I guess, to explore different interests in my life instead of like being so busy with just doing homework all the time.
Yeah.
I could actually have time to explore interest and help me like narrow down, I guess, a career path that I wanted to take. But, so the homeschooling was all about that control and really like, I know they did really want to protect us because they knew, I mean, the world can be a bad place. There are bad people out there. There's no denying that. And the issues that we have with like child trafficking and different things in America, like I understand the fear around that, and that they didn't want us to like experience or be aware of or anything. But I think the other extreme, though, is that, you know, if you just isolate your child from just experiences of life, it can really stunt their growth, their psychological, emotional, intellectual growth. And like, it's so important, I think, definitely, obviously, for children to socialize with different groups of people, to understand different perspectives. And yes, I was like socialized some around kids, but like they were around families that thought exactly or almost close to what, my family thought. So like it
Right.
wasn't really diversity of views. And of course, like my whole group was just saturated with white people. So like there wasn't like any kind of diversity of people at all. And, even my family was probably, I would say, the more stricter religious family in the group. There were a few others, like our family, that were very strict, but like a lot of people in the homeschool group, a religion was just a part of their lives. It wasn't the center, I would say, from observing. But for my family and a few others, it was just like everything. And I could definitely tell that a lot of families were really put off by my family, and how religious my parents were, how
Okay.
they would just turn down certain social opportunities because it was like against their religious beliefs or whatever. Like, for example, growing up, I was not allowed to swim with other kids my age of the opposite gender because that's a sin and it's called mixed bathing, which is so interesting. My pastor would go on and on about that.
Oh wow.
um,
Okay.
about which I thought was crazy how these prepubescent children aren't supposed to like
Yeah.
swim together at all. Like they're basically sexualizing us at a very, very young age. And
Right.
so like there were times when we were invited to things, and I remember being excited for an opportunity to go swimming. It was like this 4-H summer event. And my mom was like, if they do have swimming the last day of this camp, like you're not allowed to do that. It was a day camp thing. So of course I had to go back home every day after the end of it. But they're like, if that happens, you can't do this. So I just remember those instances of like not being allowed to do things like that. And then, my friends would go to the movie theater, but I couldn't go to the movie theater.
Right. Right.
So eventually people finally learned to just not invite my family to things because
Yeah.
we would just say no and be pious about it. And so I definitely look back, I understand why people like stopped inviting my family to things. I'm like, yeah, like I would stop inviting us too.
So Andrew, what I want to hear is how things resolve for you. Like, what was there a moment in time when you
Hmm.
decided that the problem is the religion,
Hmm.
is the Christianity, and
Hmm.
how did that resolve for you?
So I would say, in those teen years when I started questioning my sexuality and then thinking, okay, what else is the church wrong about? I
Yeah.
mean, I was a very devout fundamentalist Christian then. Like it was all I knew, and I was very emotionally dependent on those religious rituals. Definitely,
Yeah.
it was quite like emotionally addictive to do like Bible reading, praying, confessing, because it has that emotional release because you actually believe that it's like doing something and that there's someone or something out there actually like approves of that or something.
Right.
um and looking back as I got older and I struggled with my mental health, I think it was around like 16 I had tried to like kind of get away from my home church and try to go to a different church with a different youth group just to get a different experience because I was just so sick of the youth group from my old church because they were all a bunch of stuck up preppy kids who just went to the Christian school, and I just wanted something different. And so I became like friends with some that is funny. In my church, they called them bus kids because we had a bus ministry. They would drive them in. So I decided to like kind of try to socialize with the bus ministry and the kids in that. And after I met a few friends in there, I went to a different church they invited me to, and like it was nice. And like I was at first, and I was able to make friends there, and we would just go soul winning every week, which just
Okay.
means that, for people who don't know what that is, it's just soul winning is where basically as a group and as a church activity, you go and hand out tracts in neighborhoods and knock on people's doors and basically tell them they're going to hell unless they conform to your religion. So,
Yes, yes.
in a very nice way, of course. Yeah.
The sweetest way possible, yes.
So sweet. And, so even when I did that in my teen years, I didn't really like it. I was like, okay, I'm like, this is really, I don't think this is okay that we're just going to people's houses and telling them this. And of course, he would tell us, oh, we're saving these people from eternity in hell, like blah, blah. And so after it being at that church for a while, I eventually got shunned because of my perceived sexuality from people, and I got judged. And so I lost a lot of friends through that. And that was just really hard to have friends one week and not really have any the next week.
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay, I'm like, I have to slowly, I think it was at 17 years old when I was like, I need to slowly get myself out of this, because I knew it's not something that I could just cut the cord with. You know what I mean? That they would not end well, because I was still so financially dependent on my parents. And I was still living at home. So eventually I got a job at a fast food place so that I could just get out of the church environment and maybe meet some people outside
Right.
of that. And really, there were a lot of life skills that I did not have, because I felt like I did not get to develop them in being isolated. My social skills were so bad. It was really sad at 17 years old. And so fast food was me throwing myself out of my comfort zone to try to learn to socialize with different people and strangers and actually talk to people. Because growing up, I was a very shy, quiet kid, and I spent a lot of time alone whenever I could. And looking back, I definitely understand why I did that.
Yeah.
To self-soothe myself and to get myself out of stressful situations that were too much for me to handle. And being alone, I felt I guess was a break, I guess, for all that. So I spent a lot of time alone growing up, as much as I could. And and my parents were very concerned about that. And other people were he always wants to be alone. What's wrong? And of course, I was a child, so I didn't know the deeper issues that were really going on. But at 17, when I had to learn to be more independent and to socialize, and really, I don't know if I'm autistic. It's something that I've wondered about as I've been in therapy the last 2 months, because it's been Autism Awareness Month, and I've researched a lot into it, and I live now with someone who has autism, and they tell me about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I see a lot of signs in myself in that. But I'm not 100% sure, because there's the factors of, okay, is it because I'm autistic, or is it because I was isolated and I was homeschooled? And
right, a lot to unpack. Yeah,
a lot to unpack. So something I'm I don't know 100% sure, but going into that, being highly sensitive is to things, to stimulus, is something that's very common in autistic people. So that's one thing that was hard for me getting into a fast food environment, is I'm very sensitive to loud noises and bright lights and things. And it just drains me so much. And to me, I thought it was because of the lack of that I had in my life. I'm okay, if I expose myself to this, I'll eventually get used to this sensitivity, because, I wanted to be able to become a person where I could function in society. I didn't want to be a hermit the rest of my life, avoiding everyone, everything, every loud noise, every scary thing. And it did get better for me. I did adjust more, but I was in the fast food industry for 4 years, and I was so thankful for the community and the different people I met there. But after the 4 years, it took a toll on my mental health, because being in that environment was so opposite my personality. And I think after those 4 years, I grew enough as a person where I was like, you know what? I need to be truer to myself,
Mm.
and I need to be in a less stressful environment. I've grown a lot through this. I think, I'm ready to really, I guess, be more true to myself, but still learn, I guess, having that balance of like being in a comfortable environment, but still learning, like knowing when to like go out of my comfort zone, I guess you would say.
Right.
And like I've always been the kind of person to try to push myself out of my comfort zone. And like there are some times I look back where I'm like, okay, I pushed myself. I was way too hard on myself.
Mm.
Sometimes about doing certain things. And I think part of that was just really the shame and guilt that I was just raised under. And I guess I felt definitely inferior to a lot of people and very helpless, I guess. So, I I worked at a fast food restaurant to save for college.
Okay.
And so my parents would only pay for a Christian college. And that was very upsetting to me because I'm like, at that point in high school, my senior year, like I was ready to leave it all. I was
Okay.
so frustrated and I hated it so much. I did some reading and a little research on like fundamentalism and the harms of it, but I was not ready to dig deeper into it and just uproot what I was raised on.
Right. Sure.
It
Yeah.
was just too much at that time. So, I developed a lot of like coping mechanisms and trauma responses because of my religious trauma to deal with some of those certain things. But my parents, they wanted me to go to Pensacola Christian College, which is very fundamentalist, very strict. And my oldest brother went there and graduated and he loved it.
Okay.
But thankfully, I knew myself enough at the time to know that I would absolutely hate that. And I had to find another Christian college that wasn't like as bad, something that I could like tolerate and deal with, for a total of like 4 years to get my bachelor's degree. And also, Pensacola didn't have the degree I was looking for either. And like, they weren't accredited. So it's like, to me, it's like, that's just a waste of time. I'm not going to go to an unaccredited college where the credits don't mean anything.
Yeah, for sure.
So Bob Jones was another one on the list.
Okay.
Bob Jones University, which is in Greenville, South Carolina. Its roots is in fundamentalism, definitely. And after comparing the rules, Bob Jones was a lot less stricter than Pensacola. Still very strict, but compared to Pensacola, it was much better. And after like researching into it, because to me, I had to look at this school and figure out how I could survive really and not just drown in misery, basically.
Yes. Right.
And I think eventually, when I applied, I got accepted to Bob Jones, and as it got closer and closer, that's when my intuition's like, oh my gosh, like do not go to that school.
Yeah.
And so that's when eventually I was like, you know what? I decided to take that chance and just really, really be honest with my mom and saying how I really want to go to a Christian college. And I think that was when I actually when I came out to my mother and like told her why, like I will be looked down upon, I will be harassed, I would feel so out of place here, I won't fit in, I need to be in an environment where I can thrive. And it was too much for her to handle at that time, I think. And she's like, no, she's like, if you don't go there, you're just gonna have to stay home. And so I didn't want to stay home. Like I had enough of that.
Yeah.
And so, and she's like, you know what? Maybe they can fix you if you go to Bob Jones.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. And so I was like, whatever. So it was very scary because I was not sure. Like I expected the worst going to Bob Jones.
Yeah.
And like at first it was okay. And it did get really awful. Like my freshman year was really terrible. But I was on the freshman floor. I tried to stay really low key, and I was bullied and harassed a lot my freshman year of college by guys on my floor and just sometimes around the campus. And so it was really hard. So I had to learn to definitely avoid people a lot, which I have been used to that my whole life. So, but as human beings, we do need that social interaction. And when you deprive yourself of that, your mental health will most definitely suffer. And so for me, my mental health did suffer a lot because of just not belonging, not fitting in, being bullied, harassed a lot. And like, and on top of that, just college is stressful in general.
Sure. Definitely. Yeah.
Oh gosh, like all the assignments you have to do, all the tests and projects, and you have all these activities to do. And like Bob Jones, like it's a very, I was talking to a friend who used to go there yesterday, where like it's a very Ivy League type school, very preppy, and they have you on a very busy schedule. And like, for example, like they had, when I was there, you went to chapel 4 days a week. Everyone on campus had to go to chapel for like this 30 to 40 minute period of like singing songs and listening to a sermon. And we also had society every week, which was singing and a service, but except the college students did it. So it was much different, of course, but totally different, but oh God. But of course they had some fun activities to do with societies too. Societies are like the Christian version of fraternities.
Okay.
Except like you don't have your own, like you do have your own special place, but like it's very like supervised and very public. And it's really like meant for like, to them it's like spirituality and like, brothers and sisters in Christ getting together or whatever to edify each other or all that stuff. But not everyone, but a lot of people really hated society. And I especially really hated it.
Okay.
And another thing is you were required to go to 2 services, church services a week, either like 2 on Sunday as your 2 or 1 on Sunday and 1 on Wednesday. Okay. And you were required to do that. So, and then we had discipleship groups every night, just about at 10:30.
Okay. Wow.
We were required to go to.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's all these different things we had to do on top of all of our schoolwork and other jobs and activities. And I was talking to someone about this, and they're like, they treat us all like we're at seminary. Like Bob Jones is not a Bible college; it's a private Christian university. Not everyone there is there for seminary, but they try to do everything they can to indoctrinate you and overflow your life with spirituality. So it was really awful adjusting to all of that year. So after a semester of that, I'm like, okay, gosh, like how, like obviously I didn't want to go back after that first semester, but then again, I didn't want to stay at my IFB church back home.
Yeah.
So what was hard for me is that I'd always been a rule follower, and Bob Jones really made me learn to not be a rule follower. Yes.
Yes.
Really. And basically after this first semester, I had like a Christmas break, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have to figure out things that I can do to cope with all these different stressors and things at this college. And eventually, which is really hard for me to do, but I eventually, I just skipped church. That was one thing that I started doing, because it's like, you know what? I'm like, I want my Sunday to myself.
Yeah.
Like, let me have that.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. Yeah.
To sleep in. And of course, Saturdays there were no events required, but it was the only day that you were really off. And that's the only day you could really crank out homework. So it was very stressful. But for Sundays, I'm like, you know what? I'm like, when I figured out how they did church attendance, which is the honor system of you filling out a form online saying you did it, I was like, you know what? It was very hard for me to do that. Like, I do not like lying or being dishonest at all. And so it was very hard. I was like, oh gosh, I hate doing this. So I'm like, this is so bad for my mental health to even go to church, honestly. And once I started skipping church, it was like my mental health did become better. Not a lot, but better. That less stressor on my life. It's just like, okay. And it was hard because on freshman floor, there was like a leader that would check the dorm rooms every Sunday morning. And if you're in bed, they will get you out of bed and make you go to church.
Right.
And it's so ridiculous. Gosh. And so one day I actually accidentally slept in, and I hear this leader closing and opening doors in the hallway, checking every room. And I wake up hearing this. I'm like, what am I going to do? I didn't have time. So I rolled to the wall and
Yeah.
slid in between the bed and the wall on the floor.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, it was so awful. And then I cover myself up with a blanket, and this guy
Yeah.
walks in, and I'm trying so hard just not to breathe loudly. And
Yeah.
he finally leaves, and I was like, oh gosh. And then I get out. And that's when I'm like, you know what? I'm like, I learned to just leave campus. And there were some weeks that I would hide in the closet. Just because even when I got out of freshman dorm, they would still check, which is ridiculous. But yeah, so basically, I didn't go to church much that semester. But then I realized, I'm like, okay, I really need a community outside of this, a true community, because I wasn't getting that. And really what made me do that was because I think that was that semester was my third depressive episode that I had towards the end of freshman year. I was very suicidal. And, and I really that was a time in my life where I really had to sit down and really learn to think for myself and not feel all this pressure. Oh, what does the Bible tell me to do? What would my preacher say? What would my parents say? I had to really be like, what do I need? It's really the first time I guess I started listening to myself.
Yeah.
And trusting myself. It was really hard to do because in that environment, you're taught to not trust yourself, really, that you're evil and the devil can plant thoughts in your mind. Your heart is deceitful. Your flesh is deceitful or whatever. And I really realized that I really needed that true community. And I realized that I wasn't going to get it at Bob Jones University. And if I could, it would be really hard. It takes some effort to really look for and find that. So I decided to go to an affirming church that is very accepting of the LGBTQ plus community. The issue is Bob Jones has a list of churches that you're allowed to go to. Yeah.
Wow.
And of course, this church was not on the list.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go to this church. And on this form, just tell them I'm going to another church that's on their list so they will not know. Because they can't oversee everything. They can't follow every student to church and know which one they're at what time. I'm sure they would if they could, but that's just not possible. And so I took an Uber to this church in Greenville that was affirming.
Okay.
And it was a very big church. I didn't know anyone that went there. So I was there all by myself. And I remember all the nerves just walking into this huge church like I've never been to in my life. And I went to it. I was guided to a Sunday school class, and everyone in that class was married and in their 30s. And there's me, 18-year-old me, just sitting there because they didn't really have a college class at the time.
Okay.
And I was part of me is why did I do this? I'm so out of place. So eventually at that church, I was there a Sunday that they were having a visitor's luncheon. And that's when I was able to meet this wonderful family who happened to live literally right by Bob Jones within walking distance.
Okay.
And as they got to know me, they invited me to their house and things like that. And, they wanted to help me in my situation. And they eventually gave me a key to their house so that I could leave Bob Jones campus and just chill while they're at work during the day as a place to just rest and just relax. And that really did help my mental health a lot. 1 week I was so suicidal, but then when I finally met this family and had their love and acceptance, that completely changed. And that was really one of the big things I really emotionally, socially, psychologically really needed.
Yeah.
And that really helps a lot. And it really made me, experiencing that made me not want to go back home at all.
Right.
Because when you have those two comparison of things, when you actually see a better situation, you're like, oh gosh, I don't want to go back to that. And it was still hard for me to go back a second year, but I went back a second year to Bob Jones University. I was still able to see that family. And thankfully, my sophomore year, I was really able to make a lot of really good friends that year. The sophomore year was much better. And, then the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
um, it happened in like, what was that? That was like March of 2020, wasn't it? That was like when the US shut down. So like everything changed. And, you know, the mom in the family, she was very susceptible to diseases. So
Oh, okay.
she had to be very isolated. So I did not see them for like a year and a half. We texted whenever we could just for updates on things. And, it made the pandemic put a lot of stress on everyone.
Yeah.
Worldwide. It was really bad for everyone worldwide, all the stress, the lack of job opportunities, and just worrying about dying, just general.
Existential stress.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And it did take a toll on my mental health because I think during the pandemic for LGBTQ plus people, a lot of us had to be put in situations where we were not welcomed and we were isolated in situations that were not really emotionally or even physically safe for us. So I think, that was hard for the community to deal with that. And it was hard definitely for me. And, that's the year I finished school online. And, then I was wondering, I'm like, am I going to have to do like online school for the next several semesters or something? Because, at first, they acted like the pandemic would only last like a month. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, oh,
Yeah.
just stop the curve and isolate. But no, like as it got worse and worse, I'm like, this is not going to end for a long time.
Yeah. Yes.
And I went back to Bob Jones my junior year, and like that summer, that was like my fourth depressive episode that I had.
Okay.
And it was honestly, really looking back, my struggle with depression was really, it was a lot of repressed trauma, repressed emotions, and repressed sexuality, just all these different things
Yeah.
in my life that just I had never processed. And that summer is when I finally got help, like going to healthcare for mental health. And that's when, again, I tried to hide it from my parents, and like I knew how they reacted in the past to my mental health, and I was worried. And eventually this time I like had to say, you know what, I'm really depressed, like I can't even like function anymore at work. I've had to like leave 2 of my shifts early because I cannot function
Mm.
anymore because like lack of sleep and like depression are like not good at all.
Yeah.
And I had a panic attack at work one day because I was just stressing myself out because of the pressure, because it was too much. And so I said to my parents, I'm quitting my job and I'm not going back to Bob Jones if you don't let me go to a doctor and get on some kind of medication to just quickly just deal with this. So then that really like got their attention. And yeah, I manipulated them. Sadly, like that's what it had to come to for me to actually get the healthcare that I needed.
You were surviving.
Yes, I was
Yeah.
surviving. And so I was able to, get on medication, and it was rough adjusting to antidepressants. And like I knew for me, like antidepressants weren't the solution, that there were psychological things that medicine could not heal, but only
Mm.
like deal with symptoms only.
Yeah.
But I wasn't ready, I guess, at that time to dig into it because I think I was afraid of like, honestly, I was so afraid of finding out that like I guess that I was so damaged by these things that I could like never heal, or that would be hopeless, or that it's so bad. But that semester or that year, junior year, it was a very, very difficult. Still going into that in depression still,
Yeah.
and then having college and stress, all these different things, that environment on top of it, and I did get again very suicidal that semester. And then like I called my mom about it, and like she was very upset. And I really wanted to like go to a therapist,
Mhm.
but I wasn't sure how the cost was, and I didn't have a car to drive, and I wasn't familiar with how to do it online either yet. And at Bob Jones, they don't have like psychologists there; they just have like biblical counselors.
Right, right.
And to them, their view is that biblical counseling is like the only right way
Yeah.
to deal with mental health and, religion or whatever. So I definitely disagreed with their model and view of mental health. It was very closed minded, very narrow, very ignorant of the complexities of mental health and like the mind and body connection and trauma and genetics and just all these in biology and all these different things. And my mom was like, do you want to meet with one of their counselors? And I was like, no, I'm like, I really don't trust biblical counseling
Uh-huh.
at all. I'm like, they're not qualified, they're not trained. I'm like, they have a worldview they want to push on me. Like, I
Right.
don't, that's not mental health care. Like, they're
Yeah.
supposed to help me, not push their worldview or what they think, the world is or how mental health is. I'm like, it needs to be based on like science and empirical evidence, not just this pseudoscience counseling type thing.
I imagine part of the problem is that you were not fitting into their worldview, and
No, not at
that's part
all.
of the issues that were causing you the mental health issues.
Oh, most definitely. And
Yeah.
so I eventually agreed to like meet with this biblical counselor. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to just have someone to talk to and not really like ask them for advice. You know what I mean? Just to
Yeah.
spill everything out. And like, I was really honest and like I didn't expect it to really go well. Like I was emotionally prepared for it. But after like telling this guy like my story and like all these different things I had gone through in the church, the way I was treated, and like because of my sexuality, like after like spilling my guts to him for like an hour and a half, like this counselor told me and looked at me that, because basically that I was paying for my sin. After I tell him all these awful experiences and things done to me, he's like, oh, he's like, I see how you've been paying for your sin. And like, that really did hurt because, I didn't do anything to anyone to cause
Yeah.
them to be mean to me. Like I just existed, and apparently existing is just enough to deserve like eternal torture and to be punished, apparently. So, after that first session, like that was like a stab in like the heart, really. And to me, I think that was like the last straw that day of Christianity for me.
Okay.
And that's when I'm like, you know what? I'm like, it is time to deconstruct, really. And even though technically I feel like I kind of have been deconstructing, but this is
Sure.
when I was like consciously like, okay, I really need this religion has such a deep imprint on my mind in a negative way that it is hurting every aspect of my life. And I need to get out of this. I still continued meeting with him for discipleship. I agreed to that, not necessarily counseling, you would say. But I decided to do that just to really get with someone one on one who has a lot of knowledge about Christianity and the Bible and just understand it, because I'm like, before I leave something, I want to understand it in its totality. And, to me, I feel like I didn't get much like good preaching growing up on like theology
Okay.
and different things. So I'm like, you know what? This guy can help me like in a linear way work through Christianity in a cohesive way where I can like understand it because I've just been given bits and pieces my whole life, but I can cohesively get it together and just really decide, is this really for me? Like really doing like a cost benefit analysis, really. And I think this counselor had no idea that that was my intention with doing it.
Right.
Meeting with him, I didn't want to let him know that I was gonna. That's what I was like doing. And the interesting thing is, at the beginning of my junior year, once this guy found out that I think really what I told him at that time is like, I'm not really a Christian.
Okay.
And so in biblical counseling, they're not supposed to counsel people who aren't Christians. So after like 2 sessions, he's like, well, it's like, I don't think I can help you anymore because you're not a believer. So bye.
Wow. Yeah. Shock.
Yeah. So, and thankfully, like I wasn't expelled because I was open about, I just don't I think this is so ridiculous. And I think he didn't get me expelled because he saw the damage that
Yeah.
fundamentalism did to me, and how I basically, for most of my life, I lived it in fear and anxiety of everything I did wrong. And I definitely think my OCD played into that. And like, obviously, like, fundamentalism didn't help. And, you know, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. My nervous system was always so alert. And I was so scared of like a God that would like kill my family at any moment, because
Oof. Yeah.
growing up, God seems so unstable. Like, one week he was super loving, and one week he was super hateful and angry, and like one week he's like absolutely destroying Job's life and doing these things. And you know, Job was supposedly a righteous person, so it's like, and I talked to my therapist. He's like, yeah, it's like, it seems like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. No matter what you do, there's something awful is going to happen to you,
Right.
and no matter what. And I remember like an instance in my childhood where some kind of like storm or cyclone type thing. I forgot what it was called, but it was like it's a thing that happens with like a big gust of wind, extremely strong, just comes through a certain area for just a few minutes and then it's just gone. I forgot the name, but that happened. I think it was like, I was around like 16 or 17 to my house. There was this crazy wind, gust of
Oh,
wind
wow.
that came through, and everyone was home, and my family, we all thought that this wind was going to rip the roof off
Oh,
of our
wow.
house.
Yeah.
And so we all ran to the basement, and we hear all these terrible noises outside. And this lasted a few minutes, and we could hear the house just creaking terribly. I'm like, oh my gosh, like the house is just gonna blow to pieces. Like, oh my,
Yeah.
this is terrible.
Yeah.
And after it was done, the house was fine, and there were like 10 trees that have fallen down
Oh, wow.
in our backyard, and it just looked absolutely terrible. And thankfully, none of them hit our house. They were far away enough to not do that. Some of them came close, but they were far away enough. And I
Yeah.
just remember, as a response to that, my parents were like, oh my gosh, God was testing us. Oh, yes. It was like, we're fine. We passed the test. And I'm like, what in
Yeah.
the world is this? At that
Yes.
point, I'm like, y'all are crazy. Like, this is so weird.
Yeah.
So, flash forward to my time at Bob Jones, and as I deconstructed, I think it was at the end of my junior year after the biblical counseling, I told that guy that I was good. And like, he eventually wanted to try to change my sexuality through his counseling. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. That's unhealthy. So,
Good for you. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. I was like, no, thank you. So, after that summer, that's when I started digging and really like questioning the authority. Like, is the Bible actually inerrant? Is it perfect? Is its stories original? Is this really inspired by God? All these different things. And so once I actually researched and found out, number one, the Bible is not inerrant. And number two, the Bible is like full of so much mythology.
Right.
um,
Right.
and all these different things and all the contradictions in it. The foundation of that faith really started to fall apart. It is really what I needed because it had such a toxic hold on me. It was like a parasite attached to my mind that I needed to get rid of. And so that summer, as I deconstructed more and I entered my senior year of college, and that's when I knew, like, oh my gosh, I have actually, like, I think that scary moment of deconstructing is when you realize there's no turning back.
Yeah.
You're like, I can't, like, you know enough where you can't unknow something.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so it was scary, but as I learned more and more, I felt the freedom that I felt on my mind and my body. And that's when I started digging into religious trauma and understanding that what I was experiencing was religious trauma. And for anyone who doesn't know, religious trauma is just your responses to stressful or traumatic religious experiences. And symptoms can be anxiety, depression, reduced critical thinking, disassociation, nightmares, symptoms of like PTSD, a lot of
Mm.
terrible things like that.
Yeah.
And, once I understood that I was struggling with religious trauma and that the indoctrination had greatly damaged me psychologically, that's when I really started like digging into psychology and figuring out my issues. And after several months of digging into psychology and like understanding all the things psychological needs I did not get growing up, things that didn't turn out right developmentally, and toxic beliefs and fundamentalism and at Bob Jones, and like I started like putting it all together, and I was like, oh my gosh, like it was just so freeing. And like I
Mm.
honestly like cried my
Yeah.
eyes out because I had suffered not knowing what was wrong for so many years, and then I found
Yeah.
out why. And since I found out the issue, I could find a solution.
Yeah.
And that's that semester, which was the semester of the fall of 2021. I created a photo series on religious trauma, and it was just an art series using photography that told my story in an emotional way using like symbolism, and just surreal imagery. And it was a part of my internship at the school, and I decided to not submit it to my teacher because it was just such a personal work to me, and I just didn't want backlash from any of them there before I even released it. So I decided to release it online of January of 2022, and basically 6 weeks before I plan to release it, I saw that Joshua Harris has had an IGTV show called Every Story Matters, where he interviewed a lot of people who've had bad experiences in just religion or just really in Christianity. And I reached out to him, like asking if I could talk about my photo series on his show. And I honestly didn't think he would get back to me about it. Like, he'll ignore this, he'll never, it's whatever. But he finally got back to me. He's like, oh my gosh, he's like, I would love to have you on. And
Yeah.
so I was really shocked and like also super excited about that. And, he sent me like a link to schedule on his calendar. And the earliest day that I could get on a show was like the day before I went back to Bob Jones for my last semester
Oh, wow.
in my
Okay.
college career. So when I finally got on his show, and the show's like, it was like 40 minutes. I told the story because it was so important for the context of my photo series. I talked about all my religious experiences, how it affected me psychologically, all the fear, anxiety, internalized homophobia, self-hatred, depression, suicide, all these things that resulted from all these toxic teachings, and really talking about how they poorly handled mental health. And because of that video, and I said I left Christianity, I was expelled from Bob Jones University
Oh, man.
back in January 17th. And since that happened, and of course, my parents were very upset. Thankfully, I was able to move in with that family that took me in my freshman year. So I'm
Oh,
living
wow.
with
Okay.
them now, and I've escaped
Okay. Okay.
that environment, like
Good to hear.
officially, finally, after all these years. But it was definitely like the morning after I got kicked out, like I was just crying my eyes out because I knew that I would never ever have to be in this kind of environment
Mm.
again. And so now I've been really on a mission to use social media to spread awareness to religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and just toxic things in religion and in Christianity, to help people who are grappling with these issues, to help give them the tools they need to heal. Because I had to really search really hard to find the answers that I needed to heal, because no one ever in that religion would want to admit that their approach to religion was toxic and harming people because
Right.
they wanted to protect their beliefs. And so once I found out that this issue was really a common thing and really big, and once I found the deconstruction movement happening online, I'm like, you know what? I'm like, I really want to spread awareness to this issue and how it's really common and it affects people in great ways. And we're all just suffering in silence and not talking about it because the church doesn't want to, and they're very scared of it, and they don't want people to speak up. So since I was expelled and I could literally say whatever I wanted
Yes.
on the internet. After that, no more consequences after that one. So I was like, you know
Yeah.
what? I'm like, I was very careful in the approach that I took, because I definitely obviously wanted to call out the church for things that it's done, tactics they use, but like I wanted to do it in a very like more open-minded and loving way. And not be like screaming and being angry on the internet and like demoralizing people. Like I wanted to be very mature and professional about it.
Mhm.
And you know, I think it took Bob Jones a while to decide to kick me out after the video, because in that video, I was very professional, and you know, even Josh was like, you know, you have such a light and love about you. This is so incredible. And I think Bob Jones really hated that, because they paint a very ugly picture of unbelievers. So to see that someone
Yeah.
was just addressing their trauma and things like happened to them growing up in an open-minded and more loving way, that really got a lot of students' attention at the campus. And the videos started getting shared for somehow a lot around the campus. A lot of people started talking about it and all these different things. And the reasoning they said they kicked me out was because I said I wasn't a Christian anymore in that video. And like they never brought up my sexuality or anything like that. So it was just interesting the way they did it.
Yeah.
But you know, because of my research into religious trauma and different things, like I've decided to pursue psychology to become a therapist, and
Awesome.
eventually, yeah, study psychology to become a psychologist. And like really, I guess I've like committed my life, I feel like, really to bring awareness to these issues, because they're really rampant in America in general.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you know, trauma is a horrible cycle that needs to be stopped. And we really need to do what we can to stop traumatizing people
Yes.
and stop people from getting traumatized, because
Yeah.
it really puts a toll on people's mental health. And people should not be subjected to abuse under the guise of religious freedom, which I feel like what has happened in America is that so many people have been like psychologically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, physically abused, because people have used religion to do it in spiritual abuse. And, you know, and I'm just, you know, another person trying to help bring awareness to these issues and educating people on them. So thank you so much
That's
for this
awesome.
opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, I can't express to you how important it is that you tell your story and other
Thank
people
you.
get to hear it. I know there'll be people that will relate to a lot of the elements
Mhm.
of your story. I do want to give you an opportunity to let people know how they can get in touch with you. I think you have an
Mhm.
Instagram account, and then what about the photo project that you did as well?
Yes. So yeah, I'm very active on Instagram, and the photo series is actually on my Instagram.
Okay. And what's the moniker? What's the
Yeah, it's Andrew Pledger, and like the A is a 4. That's
Okay.
what I decided to
Okay.
do. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, that's where people can reach me.
Great. Andrew, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh yes, thank you for having me, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. Andrew is doing great work here to spread the knowledge of religious trauma, and his story is a painful one. I was incredibly struck by his statement that he didn't have a choice as a child. And I realized that in my own story, I did, having converted late in my teenage years. So this is something that I only observe at a distance, and it broke my heart to hear Andrew talk about that sense of powerlessness and the trauma that caused. Obviously, the repression of his sexuality, the repression of knowledge seeking, of education in certain areas like evolution and science and things of that nature would have a profound effect upon a person. And no wonder Andrew experienced depression while going to a Christian university that would be enforcing the cultural norms within evangelicalism when Andrew did not fit that profile. I'm amazed that Pensacola Christian University was so bad that Bob Jones looked better in comparison. Bob Jones is one of the most evangelical fundamentalist universities in the country. So I do not envy Andrew's time at Bob Jones. Andrew's is another story of purity culture damaging young men and women, the repression of one's sexuality, regardless of sexual orientation, is painful and trauma-inducing. It has got to stop. It is, in fact, abuse when that is done to children. I also thought it was really telling that Andrew's first act of autonomy was simply not going to church on Sunday morning. That seems so simple, but was profound. I think that enabled him to slowly assert his own autonomy and separate himself from the evangelical culture that he was embedded in. It is also heartbreaking that the Josh Harris interview, which we do have links in the show notes for, got him kicked out. But I am incredibly proud of Andrew for turning that around and becoming an activist to spread the knowledge of religious trauma. I want to thank Andrew for being on the podcast and for sharing his story, for sharing with such honesty, talking about his depression with honesty. If you want to reach out to Andrew, he does a lot of his work on Instagram. There you can also find the Josh Harris interview. And we have links for his Instagram and a link aggregator that can get to his artwork as well. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your story. The Secular Grace thought of the week, inspired by Andrew, is the small acts of autonomy. In Andrew's case, he was a rule follower, and within Bob Jones University, there were many, many rules. And so his first tiny act of defiance, his first tiny act of autonomy was not going to church on Sunday morning, or going to a different church than he was supposed to, or not going to a chapel attendance. I find something deeply profound in the simplicity of that. When we are deep within the evangelical bubble, it is sometimes hard just to do anything that isn't pre-approved and prescribed by the community around us. And a simple act of autonomy can be life-changing. Not all of us have the experience that Andrew had, where our lives are so restricted, but my encouragement to you is that you are an autonomous human being, that you have the right to have your own thoughts, you have the right to break from the culture around you, you have the right to assert your autonomy in small ways and big ways. Recognize that the uniqueness of your humanity is more important and more significant than conforming to the culture around you. I have slowly but surely been lining up interviews. Again, it's been a bit spotty of late, mostly my fault there. But we have an artist named Ursula, who was a recommendation from Marla, who was on a few weeks ago. And her story is amazing. Ursula's story is coming up. And I have a few other things on the horizon. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings.
Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist podcast.